The old veteran stood at attention, medals gleaming on his worn dress uniform, as the group of teenagers circled him like wolves. "Hey, Grandpa, nice costume. Did you get it at the dollar store?" one of them sneered, phone camera recording every second of the humiliation, while shoppers walked past with downcast eyes. The 78-year-old Marine simply straightened his back, jaw clenched in silent dignity, the same posture that had carried him through 2 tours in Vietnam and the loss of 17 brothers in arms. But what the teens didn't notice was the young cashier in the window, phone pressed to her ear, tears streaming down her face as she spoke quietly to someone who understood exactly what that uniform meant. Within 5 minutes, the rumble of engines filled the air as 4 black SUVs screeched into the parking lot. Surrounding the scene, doors flying open as Marines in full dress blues emerged in perfect formation. What secret was this old man carrying that would make an entire Marine unit drop everything to stand by his side? Harold Simmons could feel his arthritic knees threatening to buckle beneath him, but he refused to show weakness. Not now, not in uniform. The leader of the teenagers, a tall boy with a designer hoodie and perfectly styled hair, circled him like a predator. "I asked you a question, old man. Is that even a real uniform? Those medals look fake." The boy's friends laughed on cue, their phones recording every moment of Harold's humiliation. Harold's mind drifted back to Paris Island, 1968. His drill instructor standing inches from his face, screaming until veins bulged in his neck. "Simmons! The enemy will try to break you. They will try to make you forget who you are. Will you forget, recruit?" "No, sir," Harold had shouted then, and though he didn't speak now, the same resolve hardened within him. The medals they mocked, each one, carried weight. The Purple Heart from the shrapnel that still caused him pain in cold weather. The Silver Star for the night he'd carried 3 wounded men through enemy fire. These children couldn't understand what these pieces of metal truly represented. Blood, sacrifice, brotherhood. Another teen, a girl with bright blue hair, pointed at his chest. "My grandfather has real medals. Those look like something from a costume shop." Harold felt a familiar burning behind his eyes, but blinked it away. Staff Sergeant William Davis's voice echoed in his memory. "Your uniform represents every Marine who came before you and every Marine who will come after. Disrespect it, and you disrespect them all." So Harold stood taller. Let them mock. Let them film. They didn't understand that this uniform wasn't just cloth and buttons. It was a second skin that had been earned through sweat and blood. Each crease and fold meticulously maintained, not for appearances, but out of respect. The teenagers grew more emboldened by his silence. They moved closer, one of them reaching toward a medal. "Don't touch it," Harold finally spoke, his voice quiet, but firm. Not angry, just resolute. The teen hesitated, something in the old man's tone giving him pause. "What are you going to do about it, Grandpa?" the leader challenged, but Harold detected the slightest waver in his voice. Harold looked the boy directly in the eyes. "Son, this uniform represents men better than I'll ever be, men who never came home. I won't dishonor their memory by giving you what you want." For a brief moment, the teenager seemed unsure, as if glimpsing something unexpected in the old man's weathered face. But peer pressure quickly washed away that moment of connection. "Whatever, man. Probably just some crazy old dude playing dress-up," the teen said, turning to his friends for validation. They laughed, but it sounded hollow now, performative. Harold stood unflinching. He'd faced real fear, the kind these children couldn't imagine. The kind that came with the whistle of incoming mortar fire, the distant thump of helicopter rotors that might or might not reach you in time, the labored breathing of a friend bleeding out beside you. This wasn't fear. This was just noise. A middle-aged woman hurried past, eyes averted. A store employee glanced out the window, then quickly looked away. Society had trained people to ignore conflict, to stay uninvolved. Harold understood. Not everyone was trained to move toward danger, but in the Eway reflection of the store window, Harold noticed something. A young woman at the register, phone pressed to her ear, watching the scene with tears in her eyes. Unlike the others, she wasn't looking away. Someone still cared. Someone still remembered what the uniform meant, and that was enough for Harold to stand his ground, silent and dignified, as the mockery continued around him. Sarah Manning wiped away tears with the back of her hand, trying to maintain her composure at Register 5. The scene unfolding in the parking lot had stirred something deep within her. Memories of her grandfather, another Marine who'd served in Vietnam, who'd sat silently at family gatherings, who'd flinched at fireworks, who'd wept openly only once in her presence, when a stranger had thanked him for his service at a diner when she was 12. Manning, customers are waiting, her manager, Dave, called from 2 registers over. Dave was 32, wore his assistant manager badge like it was a Medal of Honor, and had spent the morning complaining about his fantasy football team. Someone should help that man, Sarah said, nodding toward the window. Dave glanced outside, shrugged. Not our problem, just teenage stuff. Stay focused on work. Sarah felt heat rise in her face. Not our problem. Wasn't that always the excuse? Her grandfather had told her how he'd returned home to people who looked away, who changed the subject, who said, "Not our problem," when veterans struggled. "Next customer, please," she called, but her attention remained fixed on the elderly Marine standing at attention while those kids circled him like vultures. The woman in front of her was buying greeting cards and barely looked up from her phone as she handed over her credit card. Sarah completed the transaction mechanically, her mind racing. Her grandfather had passed 3 years ago. At his funeral, 4 Marines had appeared, folded a flag with mathematical precision, and presented it to her grandmother. She'd slept with. That triangle of fabric beside her bed for months afterward, that man outside deserved better than this. "I'm taking my break," she announced, pulling off her name tag. "You've got 15 minutes left on your shift, Manning," Dave protested. Sarah met his gaze. "Write me up if you want." She grabbed her phone from beneath the counter and hurried to the employee bathroom, locking the door behind her. Her hands trembled as she pulled up the contact she'd saved months ago but never called. Her cousin Michael was stationed at the Marine Corps base 20 minutes away. They weren't close. He was 10 years older and had been deployed for much of her childhood, but they'd reconnected at her grandfather's funeral. "If you ever need anything," he'd told her, "call this number." She pressed dial before she could second-guess herself. Captain Brooks speaking. The voice was crisp, formal. I'm looking for Michael Manning," she stammered. "This is his cousin. Sarah, Manning is unavailable. Can I assist you?" Sarah took a deep breath. "There's a veteran here, an older Marine in his dress uniform. Some teenagers are harassing him in the parking lot of Wilson's Market on Henderson Drive. Nobody's helping him." A brief silence. "How do you know he's a Marine?" "My grandfather was a Marine. Vietnam. I recognize the uniform, the way he stands. He's wearing medals. One looks like a silver star. Please, he's just standing there, taking it while they mock him and record it on their phones." Another pause, shorter this time. "What's your name again?" "Sarah Manning." "My grandfather was Staff Sergeant James Manning." The quality of the silence changed. "James Manning? From Lima Company?" Sarah felt a chill. "Yes." "You knew him?" "Not personally, but his name is known." "Is the veteran in immediate physical danger?" "No, but we'll be there in 5 minutes. Stay inside. Don't escalate the situation." "Oh, thank you," she whispered, but the line had already gone dead. Sarah leaned against the bathroom wall, heart pounding. The captain had recognized her grandfather's name. What did that mean? She checked her watch. 5 minutes. She should get back to her register before Dave came looking for her. But first, she needed to see what was happening outside. Slipping out of the bathroom, she made her way to the front windows, positioning herself behind a display of seasonal decorations. The teenagers were still there, still taunting the old Marine, but something in the veteran's posture had changed. He seemed to be looking past them now, his eyes fixed on the road leading to the parking lot entrance. Sarah followed his gaze and felt her breath catch. In the distance, black vehicles were approaching fast. Help was coming, and somehow, she knew. These weren't just any Marines responding to a distress call. They were coming for one of their own. Captain Robert Brooks set down the phone, his mind already calculating response times and protocols. The name Manning had caught his attention. Staff Sergeant James Manning was a legend at this base. His exploits during a particularly brutal firefight in Vietnam still discussed in leadership training. "Nichols," he called to his lieutenant, who was reviewing maintenance reports at a nearby desk. "Get Williams, Rodriguez, and Keller, full dress blues. We're rolling out in 2. Lieutenant." Nichols looked up, surprise evident on his face. "Sir, we have the General's inspection in 30 minutes. The General will understand. A Marine veteran is being harassed in town. Manning's granddaughter just called it in." "Manning." Nichols straightened. "As in, the same. Now move." As Nichols hurried out, Brooks opened his desk drawer and pulled out his service cap. There was a time for regulations and a time for brotherhood. This was the latter. Within 90 seconds, the 4 Marines assembled outside the administrative building. All had dropped what they were doing without question upon hearing the situation. Each understood implicitly an attack on one Marine, especially an elderly veteran, was an attack on the Corps itself. "Williams, you drive," Brooks ordered as they moved toward the base motor pool. "Henderson Drive, Wilson's Market. Elderly Marine in dress blues being harassed by civilians." "Rules of engagement, sir?" asked Sergeant Rodriguez, the oldest of the group and a veteran of Iraq and Afghanistan. "No physical force unless he's in danger. This is about presence, not escalation." They commandeered 2 black suburban SUVs, the kind typically reserved for visiting dignitaries. Proper channels would have required requisition forms in triplicate, but Brooks knew the motor pool sergeant would understand once he explained. "Do we know who the veteran is?" asked Corporal Keller as they pulled out of the base, lights flashing but sirens silent. "Negative," Brooks replied, checking his watch. 3 minutes out. "What's the plan when we arrive, sir?" Williams asked, navigating through traffic with practiced precision. "Rodriguez and I take point. Keller and Nichols establish perimeter. We identify the veteran, assess the situation, and remind those kids what it means to wear that uniform." The Marines nodded in unison. No further explanation was necessary. As they drove, Brooks found himself thinking about his own grandfather, another Vietnam veteran who'd returned to a country that often preferred to look away from its warriors. How many times had he stood alone, enduring slights both subtle and overt? 2 minutes, Williams announced, increasing speed as they hit the main road leading into town. In the second vehicle, Lieutenant Nichols was already on his phone, calling the base command. "Sir, Captain Brooks has taken a response team to address a situation involving a veteran being harassed in town. We may need backup depending on what we find." The colonel's response was immediate. "What veteran?" "Unknown, sir. But the report came from Staff Sergeant Manning's granddaughter." A moment of silence. "Keep me updated. If it's legitimate, I want a full honor detail dispatched." "Yes, sir." In the lead vehicle, Brooks was mentally preparing. In his 15 years of service, he'd faced combat, natural disasters, and diplomatic crises, but there was something uniquely infuriating about the thought of an elderly Marine being mocked for the uniform he'd earned the right to wear. 1 minute out, Williams reported, slowing as they approached the shopping center. "I see them," Rodriguez said, pointing to a small cluster of people near the store entrance. "Looks like 5 or 6 teenagers around an older man." Brooks narrowed his eyes, trying to make out details. Even from this distance, he could see the veteran's ramrod-straight posture, the glint of medals on his chest. No Marine ever forgot how to stand at attention, no matter how many decades passed. Williams, pull up right in front of them. Rodriguez, "With me. Nichols, Keller, second vehicle, flank position." As they entered the parking lot, Brooks felt the familiar calm that always preceded action. This wasn't combat, but it was still a mission to ensure that no Marine past or present stood alone when wearing the uniform that united them across generations. "Let's remind those kids what respect looks like," he said quietly, as the SUVs accelerated toward the scene. "Semper Fi, Semper Fi," the others echoed as one. Long before he became the old man in a parking lot, before his hair turned white and his hands grew spotted with age, Harold Simmons had been a different kind of target. It was 1968, and Harold was 22 years old, crouched in muddy water that reached his waist. The air smelled of gunpowder, rotting vegetation, and fear. Somewhere nearby, a man was screaming for his mother. The dense Vietnamese jungle seemed to swallow sound and light alike, creating a world of shadows where death could come from any direction. "Simmons, we need to move now," his squad leader had shouted. "Taylor's hit bad." Harold had been a machine gunner then, carrying an M60 that felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds in the humid heat. Without hesitation, he'd slogged through the water, bullets kicking up tiny geysers around him as he made his way to where Private James Taylor lay bleeding from a chest wound. "I got you, brother," Harold had told the terrified 19-year-old. He'd hoisted Taylor onto his shoulders in a fireman's carry, still clutching his M60, and started the long trek back to the extraction point. 2 more Marines fell during that retreat. Harold went back for them too, making 3 trips through enemy fire, refusing to leave anyone behind. By the 3rd trip, he'd taken shrapnel in his left thigh, but the pain barely registered. All that mattered was getting his brothers out. Taylor survived. So did Corporal Martinez. Private First Class Wilson didn't make it to the medevac helicopter. For his actions that day, Harold received the Silver Star, the medal currently being mocked by teenagers who'd never known true fear, true brotherhood, or true sacrifice. 3 months after that firefight, Harold's unit was ambushed near the Laotian border. 7 Marines died in the first volley of gunfire. Harold, despite a concussion from an explosion that had thrown him 20 feet, rallied the survivors. For 18 hours, they held their position against overwhelming odds until reinforcements finally arrived. 10 more brothers lost. 10 more. Names Harold carried. He'd come home with a Purple Heart, shrapnel still embedded too close to his spine to safely remove, and nightmares that persisted to this day. He'd come home to a country that looked away, that called him baby killer, that seemed eager to forget the war and those who'd fought it. But Harold never forgot. Not his brothers who came home damaged in body and spirit. Not the 17 who came home in flag-draped coffins. Not the Vietnamese civilians caught in the crossfire of a war they never asked for. He remembered Private Wilson's collection of baseball cards, which he'd kept carefully wrapped in plastic, even in the jungle. He remembered how Sergeant Davis could mimic any bird call perfectly. He remembered how Lieutenant Murray had written letters to the parents of every man who died under his command, spending nights crafting personal messages that went far beyond. Standard condolences. Harold remembered them all, their faces, their voices, their dreams of what they'd do when they got home. Some nights, when sleep eluded him, Harold would take out the small photo album he kept in his bedside drawer. Faded photographs of young men in uniform, arms slung around each other's shoulders, trying to smile despite the darkness in their eyes. Boys who never had the chance to become old men. After Vietnam, Harold had tried to build a normal life. He'd worked construction for 30 years, married his high school sweetheart Elaine, raised 2 children who had given him 4 grandchildren. He'd never spoke much about the war, not even to Elaine. Some burdens weren't meant to be shared. When Elaine died of cancer 5 years ago, Harold had nearly followed her. The loneliness was almost unbearable. It was his Marine discipline that kept him going, the same discipline that now kept him standing straight, while teenagers mocked the uniform that had been soaked with his blood, and the blood of his brothers. His dress blue still fit perfectly. Harold made sure of that, even as his body aged around him. Every Veterans Day and Memorial Day, he wore them to honor those who couldn't. He polished the brass buttons until they gleamed, arranged his medals with mathematical precision, and stood tall for those who would never stand again. Today was no different. He'd attended a memorial service for one of his Vietnam brothers who'd finally lost his battle with Agent Orange exposure. Afterward, He'd stopped at this store to pick up a few necessities before heading home to his empty house. He hadn't expected to become a spectacle for bored teenagers. But then, life rarely gave you the battles you expected. You just fought with what you had where you stood, and Harold Simmons had never retreated from a fight. The first sign that something had changed was the sudden cessation of traffic on Henderson Drive. Cars pulled to the side as two black SUVs with government plates cut through the afternoon congestion, moving with purposeful speed. The leader of the teenagers, a 17-year-old named Jason Miller, was in the middle of a particularly cruel imitation of Harold's rigid posture when he noticed the vehicles entering the parking lot. Something about their approach, direct, coordinated, intent, made the laughter die in his throat. "Dude," one of his friends said, lowering his phone. "Are those cops?" The SUVs executed a perfect synchronized turn, positioning themselves to block any potential exit. The teenagers instinctively moved closer together, juvenile bravado suddenly replaced by uncertainty. Harold remained motionless, but his eyes tracked the vehicles with recognition. After decades in the Corps, he knew a Marine operation when he saw one. Every movement was deliberate, tactically sound, leaving nothing to chance. The doors of the lead SUV opened simultaneously. Two Marines in immaculate dress blues emerged, their movements precise and fluid. From the second vehicle, two more appeared, taking flanking positions. The parking lot fell silent. Even the ambient sounds of traffic and commerce seemed to fade away, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Captain Brooks assessed the situation with a single sweep of his gaze. The elderly Marine, the teenagers, phones still recording, but expressions now confused and wary. The growing crowd of onlookers emerging from the store, drawn by the unexpected drama. "Marines, attention!" Brooks ordered, his voice carrying across the parking lot without needing to shout. As one, the four Marines snapped to attention, a synchronized movement born of thousands of hours of drill and discipline. Brooks advanced 5 measured steps toward Harold, stopping at the perfect distance for a formal exchange. Behind him, Rodriguez matched his movements exactly, while Nichols and Keller maintained their positions, ensuring full coverage of the scene. The teenagers began to back away, sensing they were suddenly out of their depth. Jason, however, remained frozen in place, his phone still recording, but now hanging limply at his side. Inside the store, Sarah Manning pressed her hand against the window, barely breathing as she watched the scene unfold. Around her, customers and employees alike had stopped what they were doing, drawn to the unexpected ceremony taking place in their ordinary suburban parking lot. Brooks stood before Harold, his posture a mirror image of the older man's. For 3 heartbeats, they regarded each other in silence, the current Marine and his predecessor, separated by decades, but united by the same cloth. Then, Brooks raised his right hand in a perfect salute. "Sir," he said, his voice carrying clearly to all those watching. "Captain Robert Brooks, United States Marine Corps, reporting as requested." Harold's weathered face remained stoic, but those closest might have noticed the slight moisture gathering in his eyes as he returned the salute with equal precision. "At ease, Captain," he responded, his voice steady, despite the emotion building in his chest. Brooks lowered his salute and shifted to parade rest. Behind him, the other Marines remained at attention, their presence creating an island of military order in the civilian chaos of the parking lot. The teenagers had retreated to the periphery now, their phones lowered, the atmosphere of mockery completely dissolved. In its place was something new, a dawning realization that they had drastically misjudged the man they'd been tormenting. "I apologize for our delayed response time, sir," Brooks continued, loud enough for all to hear. "When we received word that a Marine was facing hostile action, we deployed immediately." A murmur ran through the growing crowd. Hostile action. The military terminology transformed what had seemed like harmless teenage fun into something more serious, more shameful. Sarah slipped out of the store entrance, drawn by forces she couldn't fully articulate. Dave, her manager, called after her, but his voice seemed to come from another world. The Marines had formed a protective perimeter, Around Harold now, their positioning automatic, a living wall of discipline and respect. To the civilians watching, it might have seemed excessive for what had been a case of teenage harassment, but those with military experience understood. This was about more than one man. This was about what he represented. We received intelligence that unauthorized individuals were showing disrespect to a Marine in uniform, Brooks announced, his voice projecting authority without aggression. We take such incidents seriously. The parking lot had become a stage, the mundane trappings of suburban commerce transformed into the backdrop for something ancient and profound. Warriors acknowledging one of their own, the unbroken line of service and sacrifice that connected them across time. And at the center of it all stood Harold Simmons, no longer alone. Captain Brooks maintained his formal posture as he studied the elderly Marine before him. The man's uniform, though decades old, was impeccable. Every crease sharp, every button gleaming, medals aligned with mathematical precision. But it was the ribbons and decorations that made Brooks's breath catch. "Sir," Brooks said, his voice carrying a new note of reverence, "I note you wear the Silver Star and Purple Heart." Harold gave a slight nod, uncomfortable with the attention, but unwilling to dishonor the moment with false modesty. "A long time ago, Captain." Brooks's gaze moved methodically across the medals on Harold's chest, reading them like a sacred text. "Vietnam, 2 tours if I'm not mistaken. 3rd Marine Division, 1st Battalion, 3rd Marines," Harold confirmed. "The Lava Dogs." A ripple of recognition passed through the Marines present. The 1st Battalion had earned a legendary reputation. In Vietnam, particularly during the battles near the DMZ, Rodriguez stepped forward, maintaining protocol but clearly moved. "Sir, my father served with the 3rd Marines at Khe Sanh." Harold's eyes found Rodriguez's. "What was his name, Marine?" "Staff Sergeant Miguel Rodriguez, sir." Harold was quiet for a moment, searching decades-old memories. "Tall man? Carried a beat-up harmonica?" Rodriguez's face transformed with astonishment. "Yes, sir. He played it every night." "Your father saved my life at Con Thien, best spotter in the company." Harold's voice softened with the weight of memory. "A good Marine, a good man." Rodriguez stood straighter, visibly affected. "Thank you, sir. He speaks of those days rarely." "Sequis." "All do, son." The exchange wasn't lost on the watching crowd. The teenagers, who moments ago had been mocking this old man, now witnessed something they couldn't fully comprehend, the invisible bonds of a brotherhood forged in circumstances they could never imagine. Jason, the ringleader, lowered his phone. Completely, his face flushed with shame. The realization of what he'd done, who he'd been tormenting, was beginning to sink in. Captain Brooks turned slightly, addressing the gathering crowd while maintaining formal protocol. "This Marine served his country with distinction during one of our most difficult conflicts. The decorations he wears tell a story of exceptional courage and sacrifice." He gestured toward the Silver Star. "This medal is not given lightly. It, Joel, is the 3rd highest military decoration for valor in combat. The actions required to earn it are the kind most people run from, not toward." The crowd had grown now, store employees and customers forming a loose circle around the scene. Among them, Sarah Manning had moved closer, tears streaming freely down her face as she watched the Marines honor the elderly veteran. Brooks faced Harold again. "Sir, may I ask your name and rank for the record?" Harold squared his already straight shoulders. "Gunnery Sergeant Harold J. Simmons, USMC, retired." Brooks nodded, then surprised everyone by taking a step back and raising his voice. "Attention to orders!" The Marines instantly snapped to attention, their movements synchronized by thousands of hours of drill. Marines present will recognize Gunnery Sergeant Harold J. Simmons, decorated combat veteran of the Vietnam War, recipient of the Silver Star for gallantry in action, the Purple Heart for wounds received in combat, and numerous campaign medals, denoting service above and beyond the call of duty. Brooks executed another perfect salute, held it for the prescribed 3 seconds, then called out, "Marines, salute!" As one, the 4 Marines rendered their salutes to Harold, who returned the gesture with equal precision despite the arthritis that made his joints ache. The silence in the parking lot was absolute. Even those with no military connection could sense they were witnessing something profound, a recognition that transcended the ordinary rhythms of civilian life. From the back of the crowd, an elderly man in a Vietnam veteran's cap pushed forward. Without a word, he came to attention and saluted Harold as well. Then another, a middle-aged woman in a faded Army t-shirt. One by one, veterans in the crowd revealed themselves, stepping forward to render honors. Jason and his friends had retreated to the edge of the scene, their earlier bravado completely evaporated. The phones that had recorded mockery now captured something entirely different, a spontaneous ceremony of respect. "Marines, order arms," Brooks commanded after the appropriate interval, and the salutes were crisply lowered. He turned back to Harold, his voice lower now, meant just for the older Marine. "Gunny, it's an honor to stand in your presence. I apologize for the disrespect you encountered today." Harold's stoic expression softened slightly. "No apology needed, Captain. You and your Marines have more than compensated." But Brooks wasn't finished. He reached into his pocket and withdrew his phone. "Sir, with your permission, I'd like to make a call. There are others who would want to know you're here." Harold looked puzzled. "Others?" Brooks nodded solemnly. "Yes, sir, many others." Captain Brooks stepped aside to make his call, speaking in low, urgent tones. The other Marines maintained their positions around Harold, creating a protected space in the midst of the growing crowd. Lieutenant Nichols approached Harold with disciplined precision. "Sir, would you be comfortable moving to a more suitable location? The store has offered their break room." Harold shook his head. "I've spent enough time in my life retreating, Lieutenant. I'll stand where I am." Nichols nodded, respecting the decision without question. "Understood, sir," Captain Brooks returned, slipping his phone into his pocket. His expression had changed subtly, a new intensity in his eyes, a slight adjustment in his posture that other Marines would recognize as suppressed emotion. "Gunnery Sergeant Simmons," he said formally, "I've just spoken with Colonel James Harrison, base commander. He sends his personal regards and will be joining us shortly." Harold's eyebrows rose slightly. "The base commander? For an old retired gunny?" "That's not necessary, Captain." Brooks hesitated, something uncharacteristic for a Marine officer of his bearing. "Sir, there's something I should tell you, something personal." Harold studied the younger man's face, recognizing the look of someone carrying a weight they needed to set down. "Proceed, Captain." Brooks squared his shoulders. "My father was 2nd Lieutenant Thomas Brooks, Echo Company, 1st Battalion, 3rd Marines, March 1969. Harold's stoic expression faltered for the first time. "Tommy Brooks," he said softly, the name clearly awakening memories. "Radio call, sign Bookworm." Brooks nodded, emotion now visible beneath his professional demeanor. "Yes, sir, that was him. Your father was a good officer, cared about his men, rare for a butter bar." Harold's eyes grew distant, seeing across decades. "We were in some bad places together. The Hill 861 operation," Brooks said quietly. "April 30th, 1969. Harold's face changed, something dark and painful crossing his features. "You know about that day. My father told me the story every year on my birthday. It's why I became a Marine." The surrounding crowd had fallen silent, sensing they were witnessing something deeply personal, yet somehow universal. The long threads of history that connected these men across generations. Brooks continued, his voice carrying just far enough for those nearby to hear. "My father was leading a patrol when they were ambushed. Heavy fire, no cover. He took 2 rounds to the leg, couldn't move. The radio operator was killed instantly. They were pinned down, ammunition running low." Harold's eyes never left the younger man's face, but his mind was clearly back in that jungle, reliving those terrifying moments. "Dad said they were preparing for the worst when a machine gunner from another squad appeared from nowhere, laying down suppressive fire that drove the enemy back long enough for the wounded to be moved." Brooks's voice remained steady through Marine discipline alone. "That gunner then carried my father over a kilometer of jungle terrain to the extraction point, despite being wounded himself." A murmur passed through the crowd. Even the teenagers still hovering at the periphery were transfixed now. That Marine's name was Harold Simmons, Brooks said, his voice finally betraying emotion. My father told me if it wasn't for you, I would never have been born. Every birthday he would say, remember to thank Harold Simmons for your life. Harold's weathered face revealed nothing, but those close enough could see the sheen of moisture in his eyes. I was just doing my job, Captain. Any Marine would have done the same. With respect, sir, that's not true. What you did that day went far beyond duty. Brooks straightened, regaining his composure. My father passed away 3 years ago, cancer. His final request was that if I ever had the honor of meeting you, I was to shake your hand and say thank you from both of us. Brooks extended his hand, not a military gesture now, but a deeply human one. Harold looked at the offered hand for a long moment, then took it in a firm grip. The two men stood connected, past and present, merging in a simple touch. Your father was worth saving, Harold said quietly. He was a good man. He said the same about you, sir. The moment stretched, waited with unspoken understanding, then Brooks released Harold's hand and stepped back, resuming his formal military bearing. The watching crowd had grown silent, many wiping away tears. Even Jason, the teenage ringleader, stood transfixed, his earlier mockery forgotten as he witnessed the power of a bond forged in circumstances he could never imagine. Sarah Manning had moved closer, drawn by an invisible pull. This was why her grandfather had sat silently at family gatherings, flinching at sudden noises. This was the weight he'd carried. This was what that uniform truly represented. From the edge of the parking lot came the sound of the more vehicles approaching, a convoy of military transports moving with purpose and precision. Captain Brooks checked his watch, then nodded with satisfaction. Right on time, he said. Colonel Harrison believes in punctuality. Harold straightened his already perfect posture. Then we shouldn't keep him waiting, Captain. What had begun as an ordinary Tuesday afternoon at Wilson's Market had transformed into something extraordinary. The crowd continued to grow, rippling outward from the center, where Harold stood surrounded by Marines in dress blues, store employees. Abandoned their posts, customers left shopping carts unattended, and passing vehicles pulled into the parking lot, drawn by the unusual sight. A community that normally moved in separate orbits, individuals isolated by the rhythms of modern life, was becoming something else, something connected and aware. Dave, the assistant manager who had earlier dismissed Sarah's concerns, now stood awkwardly at the edge of the crowd, his fantasy football league forgotten. He kept glancing at Sarah, who had positioned herself near the Marines, clearly part of this unfolding story in ways he didn't understand. What's happening? A woman asked, joining the gathering. That old man in the Marine uniform, a bystander, explained he was being harassed by some teenagers and then actual Marines showed up to defend him. Turns out he's some kind of war hero. The story passed through the crowd in whispers, gaining details, sometimes accurate, sometimes embellished, but always conveying the essential truth. Something meaningful was happening here, something worth witnessing. Social media accelerated the process. Phones recorded and shared in real time, broadcasting the scene to an invisible audience. Local community groups lit up with messages. Something big happening at Wilson's Market. Marines in dress blues in the parking lot. Vietnam vet getting recognition. You need to see this. A local news van pulled in, a reporter and cameraman quickly setting up at the periphery. The presence of media further legitimized the gathering, transforming it from random spectacle to documented event. Among the observers, different reactions played across faces, some curious, some moved, some uncomfortable. For many, this public display of military brotherhood was foreign, something glimpsed in movies but rarely in everyday life. A middle-aged woman in medical scrubs pushed through to the front, her eyes fixed on Harold. "Excuse me," she said to Captain Brooks. "I'm a nurse at the VA. Is he okay? Does he need assistance?" Before Brooks could answer, Harold spoke. "I'm fine, ma'am. Just a bit of excitement for an old Marine." She nodded but stayed nearby, professional. Instincts clearly engaged. Jason and his friends had retreated to the edge of the parking lot, their earlier swagger completely evaporated. They huddled together, uncertain what to do. Their phones, which had recorded mockery, now felt like evidence of something shameful. One by one, they deleted the videos they'd taken earlier. Maybe we should just go, one of the girls suggested. Jason shook his head. No, we need to stay. He didn't elaborate, but his expression suggested complex emotions churning beneath the surface. Near the store entrance, an elderly woman with a cane watched intently. Her eyes never left Harold, and there was something in her gaze that spoke of recognition beyond the moment, perhaps memories of another uniform, another war, another time. 2 police cruisers arrived, officers stepping out to assess the situation. Captain Brooks met them halfway, a brief conversation ensuring they understood this was not a disturbance requiring intervention. The officers nodded, then positioned themselves at the edges of the gathering, their presence adding another layer of official sanction. A man in a business suit pushed through the crowd, his demeanor suggesting authority. "I'm the store manager," he announced to Brooks. "Whatever you need, we're at your disposal. We can close the store if necessary." Brooks shook his head. "That won't be required, sir, but we appreciate your cooperation. This shouldn't take much." Longer. From the edge of the parking lot came the sound of more vehicles, not the expected military convoy, but civilian cars. Veterans who had heard about what was happening and felt compelled to come, drawn by bonds invisible to civilians but as real as gravity to those who had served. They emerged from their vehicles already moving with purpose, men and women of different ages, some in partial uniform, others in veteran organization caps or jackets. They approached with respect, forming a loose honor guard around the periphery, creating another ring of protection and recognition. A man on a motorcycle arrived, the machine's rumble announcing his presence before he cut the engine. His leather vest bore the insignia of a veterans motorcycle club. Without a word, he took position near Harold, standing at parade rest, his weathered face solemn. Sarah watched it all, understanding now why her cousin Michael had given her that phone number, why her grandfather had told her to always respect the uniform. This wasn't just about one old Marine being mocked by teenagers. This was about something deeper, an unwritten code that bound these people together across time and space. More vehicles were arriving now, including the convoy of military transports, visible at the entrance to the parking lot. Whatever was about to happen, it was clear that this unplanned gathering had become something significant, a moment when the invisible bonds of service and sacrifice became briefly, powerfully visible to all. Jason Miller stood at the edge of the crowd, a maelstrom of emotions churning inside him. Shame, confusion, fear. The gravity of what he'd done, what they'd all done, was sinking in with each passing minute, with each new arrival, with each revelation about the old man they had mocked. His friends shifted nervously beside him. "Maybe we should just leave," Zach whispered again, "before things get worse." "No." Jason's voice was quiet but firm. "We have to stay." "Why? You want to get arrested or something?" Jason shook his head. "That's not going to happen. But we need to." He trailed off, struggling to articulate the feeling growing inside him. Across the parking lot, he watched as more Marines arrived, as veterans gathered, as the community formed around the elderly man in the uniform. The man they'd laughed at. The man they'd filmed for likes and follows. The man who, as he was now learning, had saved lives, had fought for his country, had carried wounded comrades through gunfire. "I need to apologize," Jason finally said. His friends stared at him in disbelief. "Are you crazy? With all these Marines around, they'll kill you." "They won't," Jason said, though he wasn't entirely sure. "And even if they did, wouldn't I deserve it?" Without waiting for his friends to respond, Jason began moving through the crowd. It wasn't easy. People had packed in tightly, and no one was eager to make way for a teenager. But slowly, steadily, he made his way toward the center, where Harold stood with Captain Brooks. He felt eyes on him as he approached, suspicious, judgmental eyes. Someone must have recognized him from earlier. A hand reached out to stop him, but Jason ducked past. "Excuse me," he said, his voice cracking slightly as he reached the inner circle. I want to... Captain Brooks turned, his gaze hardening as he recognized Jason. "Young man, this is not the time or place for..." "Please," Jason interrupted, something he'd never have dared to do before today. "I need to speak to him, to apologize." Brooks studied the teenager for a long moment, weighing sincerity against protocol. Finally, he stepped slightly aside, though his posture made it clear he was prepared to intervene if necessary. Jason found himself face to face with Harold Simmons. Up close, the elderly Marine seemed both more frail and more formidable, his skin paper thin with age, but his eyes clear and penetrating, seeing through pretense to the core of things. "Sir," Jason began, his rehearsed words evaporating under that steady gaze. Harold said nothing, simply waiting with the patience of a man who had learned that lesson in the hardest possible ways. Jason swallowed hard. "What we did was wrong. What I did was wrong. I didn't understand. I didn't know who you were." "Would it have mattered?" Harold asked quietly. "If I'd been just an old man in a costume, would that have made your actions right?" The question hit Jason like a physical blow. "No, sir," he admitted. "It wouldn't." Harold nodded slightly, acknowledging the honesty. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," Jason continued, finding his voice. "I don't deserve that, but I want you to know that I'm sorry, really sorry, and I want to make it right somehow." A murmur ran through the watching crowd. This public contrition from a teenager, not forced, not coerced, but offered freely, was as unexpected as the arrival of the Marines had been. Harold studied the boy for a long moment before speaking. "You know what the hardest thing about wearing this uniform was?" he asked. Jason shook his head. "It wasn't the enemy fire. It wasn't the jungle. It wasn't even watching my friends die." Harold's voice remained steady, but emotion flickered behind his eyes. It was coming home to a country that didn't want to know what we'd been through, that looked away, that chose not to see. Jason stood very still, absorbing the words. "When you and your friends mocked this uniform," Harold continued, "you weren't doing anything new. You were just doing what generations before you have done, looking without seeing, judging without understanding." The crowd had fallen silent, hanging on every word. "So I don't need your apology, son. What I need, what every veteran needs, is for you to truly see. To understand that freedom isn't free, that the comfortable life you take for granted was bought and paid for by people willing to give everything." Harold reached out slowly and placed a weathered hand on Jason's shoulder. "If you want to make amends, don't do it for me. Do it by seeing clearly from now on, by teaching others to see." Tears welled in Jason's eyes, spilling down his cheeks. Without shame. "I will, sir. I promise." For the first time, Harold's stoic expression softened into something almost like a smile. "Then we're square, Marine." "I'm not a Marine, sir." "Not yet," Harold replied, "but you've taken your first step toward understanding what that means." Captain Brooks, who had been watching this exchange with careful attention, finally stepped forward. "The colonel will be here momentarily," he said to Harold, "but I believe this young man has shown unusual courage today." Jason looked up in surprise. "It takes one kind of courage to face enemy fire," Brooks continued. "It takes another kind to face your own mistakes. Both are valuable to the core." For the first time since this extraordinary afternoon began, Harold Simmons smiled fully. "Well said, Captain." Jason stood straighter, something new awakening inside him, something that felt like purpose. The military convoy had arrived, parking with precision at the edge of the lot. From the lead vehicle emerged a tall man with silver hair and the insignia of a full colonel. He approached with purposeful strides, flanked by two staff officers. Captain Brooks called out, "Attention on deck!" Every Marine present snapped to attention, creating a ripple effect through the crowd, as veterans of all branches followed suit. Colonel James Harrison moved directly to Harold, rendering a crisp salute. "Gunnery Sergeant Simmons, Colonel James." "Harrison, Base Commander. It's an honor to meet you, sir." Harold returned the salute with equal precision. "The honor is mine, Colonel." Harrison maintained military formality, but his eyes conveyed deeper emotion. "When Captain Brooks informed me of your presence, I felt it necessary to attend personally. Your reputation precedes you, Gunny." Harold appeared genuinely puzzled. "My reputation, sir?" "The Marines have long memories, Gunnery Sergeant." Harrison gestured to the gathered servicemen. "Your actions at Hill 861 are still taught at Officer Candidate School as an example of extraordinary valor under fire." A murmur passed through the crowd. The teenagers, including Jason, listened with growing awe. Harrison continued, "I've taken the liberty of arranging for a proper escort back to base, should you accept our invitation to address the men and women under my command." Harold hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. "That's not necessary, Colonel. I was just doing my job, same as any Marine would." "With respect, Gunny, what you did went far beyond the call of duty." Harrison's voice carried across the parking lot. "And I believe these people would benefit from hearing about it directly from you." The crowd had grown silent, expectant. Even the store employees who had emerged to watch were rapt, sensing they were witnessing something significant. Harold looked around at the gathering, the mix of military and civilian faces, the veterans standing at parade rest, the teenagers with newfound respect in their eyes. His gaze lingered on Sarah Manning, who reminded him so much of his own granddaughter. Finally he nodded. "Very well, Colonel, but I speak for those who can't be here, not for myself." Harrison stepped back, yielding the impromptu stage to Harold. For a moment Harold stood silent, gathering his thoughts. When he spoke, his voice was clear and strong, belying his years. "I'm not accustomed to speeches. Marines are taught to act, not talk." A slight smile crossed his weathered face. "But some things need to be said, need to be remembered." He gestured to his uniform. "This isn't just cloth and brass. Each thread represents a promise I made to my country, to my fellow Marines, and to myself." Harold pointed to the silver star on his chest. "This medal doesn't belong to me alone. It belongs to Private James Taylor, who lay bleeding in the jungle and never gave up. It belongs to Corporal Luis Martinez, who covered our retreat despite his own wounds. It belongs to Private First Class William Wilson, who didn't make it to the helicopter." His voice never wavered, but emotion shone in his eyes. When you see an old man in a uniform like this, you're not just seeing one veteran, you're seeing all of us, the ones who came home and the ones who didn't. The crowd stood motionless, many wiping away tears. In Vietnam, we learned that the person next to you was all that mattered. Not politics, not protests, not even survival sometimes. Harold's gaze swept across the gathering. When bullets are flying, you don't ask about someone's background or beliefs. You just know they're wearing the same uniform, fighting the same fight. He touched the fabric of his sleeve. "This uniform means I would have died for any one of you, not because I knew you, not because I agreed with you, but because that's the promise we make." Harold looked directly at Jason now. "Young man, earlier today you asked if my medals were real. They are, but their value isn't in the medal. Their value is in the blood that earned them, the lives they represent." He indicated the Purple Heart pinned to his chest. "This one means I left part of myself in a jungle halfway around the world. There's still shrapnel near my spine that the doctors couldn't safely remove. On cold mornings, I feel Vietnam in my bones." Harold's gaze moved to the gathered Marines. "But I'd do it again, not for glory, not for medals, but for the man on my left and the woman on my right, for the promise this uniform represents." The parking lot remained absolutely silent, every person present understanding they were witnessing something profound, not just an old man's reminiscence, but a living connection to history, to sacrifice, to a code of honor that transcended generations. "17 of my brothers never came home," Harold continued, his voice finally showing the weight of years. "I carry their names with me every day. When I put on this uniform, I wear it for them too, for the lives they never got to live, for the families who received folded flags instead of returning sons. He straightened his already perfect posture. So when you see a veteran, any veteran from any conflict, remember, you're not just seeing one person. You're seeing all of us, the visible and the invisible, the living and the dead. And every one of us was willing to give everything for you. As Harold finished speaking, a profound silence held the crowd. Then, somewhere in the back, a single person began to applaud. The sound spread, growing into a wave of appreciation that washed over the parking lot. Spontaneous, heartfelt, unstoppable. As the applause gradually subsided, Colonel Harrison stepped forward again. He consulted briefly with Captain Brooks, their conversation inaudible to the crowd. Both men nodded, seeming to reach agreement on something significant. Harrison addressed the gathering. Ladies and gentlemen, what began as an unfortunate incident has become something more meaningful, a moment of recognition long overdue. He turned to Harold. Gunnery Sergeant Simmons, on behalf of the United States Marine Corps, I would like to render appropriate honors. With your permission, sir? Harold appeared momentarily uncertain, but military discipline prevailed. Proceed. Colonel? Harrison nodded to one of his staff officers, who immediately returned to the convoy. Meanwhile, Brooks was on his radio, issuing crisp instructions. Within minutes, the distant sound of engines announced the arrival of more vehicles. A transport truck pulled into the parking lot, and from it emerged 24 Marines in immaculate dress blues, a full honor guard detail. They formed with practiced precision, arranging themselves in two perfect lines, flanking the area where Harold stood. Each Marine moved with the fluid synchronization that comes only from countless hours of drill, creating a living corridor of honor. The crowd instinctively moved back, creating space for what was clearly becoming a formal ceremony. Store customers, who had merely stopped to watch now, put down their shopping bags, sensing they were witnessing something rare and significant. A Marine carrying a folded American flag approached Colonel Harrison, who received it with formal precision. Gunnery Sergeant Simmons, Harrison announced, his voice carrying across the now silent parking lot. This flag was flown over Marine Corps Base Quantico on the 50th anniversary of the action at Hill 861. It was meant to be presented to you at that time, but you could not be located. Harold's stoic expression faltered slightly. After Vietnam, he had deliberately kept a low profile, avoiding military reunions and ceremonies, preferring to honor his fallen comrades in private. The Corps never forgets its own, Harrison continued. Today, we correct that oversight. At a signal from the colonel, the honor guard snapped to attention. A bugler stepped forward from the ranks, raising his instrument to his lips. The clear, poignant notes of attention rang out across the parking lot, instantly recognizable to anyone with military service. Veterans in the crowd automatically straightened, muscle memory responding to the call. Following protocol, two Marines approached Harold, flanking him with formal precision. This was not improvised. Every movement followed established tradition for honoring distinguished veterans. Harrison's voice took on the cadence of official ceremony. Attention to orders. The President of the United States and the Commandant of the Marine Corps have authorized the presentation of this flag to Gunnery Sergeant Harold J. Simmons in recognition of his valorous service to our nation during the Vietnam War, particularly his extraordinary actions at Hill 861 on April 30th, 1969. The two Marines beside Harold executed a synchronized movement, creating the formal tableau of a military presentation. Colonel Harrison advanced, holding the folded flag with white-gloved hands. On behalf of a grateful nation and the United States Marine Corps, I present you with this flag as a token of our appreciation for your honorable and faithful service. As Harrison extended the flag, Harold accepted it with trembling hands, the only visible sign of the emotion he kept carefully controlled. For decades, he had carried his memories in private, neither seeking nor expecting recognition. The bugler raised his instrument again, and the solemn notes of taps floated across the parking lot. The mournful melody traditionally played at military funerals and memorial services spoke to the dual nature of this moment, honoring the living veteran before them while acknowledging those who never returned. Veterans throughout the crowd rendered salutes. Civilians placed hands over hearts. Even the teenagers, who had begun the day mocking what they didn't understand, stood respectfully silent. Harold clutched the flag to his chest, his eyes glistening but his posture remaining marine straight. Each note of taps seemed to reach beyond the present moment, connecting this ordinary parking lot to distant battlefields where young men had given everything. As the final note faded, Colonel Harrison called out, "Honor Guard, present arms." 24 rifles rose in perfect unison, gleaming in the afternoon sun. The Marine Honor Guard held their salute for a precisely timed 3 count before Harrison commanded, "Order arms." The rifles lowered with synchronized precision. For Harold, this formal ceremony was both honor and burden, recognition of his service, but also a powerful reminder of those who had served alongside him and never returned to receive such honors. His weathered hands gripped the folded flag tightly, his knuckles, white with emotion, held in check. Sarah Manning watched from nearby, tears streaming freely down her face. She understood now, in a way she never had before, why her grandfather had kept his own service so private, why the folded flag at his funeral had meant so much to her grandmother. Jason and his friends stood transfixed, witnessing a tradition that stretched back generations, the solemn recognition of sacrifice that transcended politics, generations, and changing times. The Honor Guard reassembled into formation, awaiting their next command. What had begun as an impromptu response to disrespect had transformed into something profound, a long-delayed recognition, a community awakening, a bridge between civilian life and military sacrifice. As the formal ceremony concluded, the military precision of the moment began to soften. The Honor Guard maintained their positions, but the rigid formality eased as Colonel Harrison engaged Harold in quiet conversation. Captain Brooks, meanwhile, had noticed Jason and his friend standing awkwardly at the edge of the ceremonial space. The teenagers' earlier mockery had been the catalyst for this entire event, and Brooks felt a responsibility that extended beyond the immediate moment. With a brief word to Colonel Harrison, Brooks approached the small group of teenagers. They tensed visibly as he drew near, clearly uncertain what to expect from a Marine officer. "At ease," Brooks said, his voice firm but not unkind. "I'd like a word with all of you." Jason stepped forward slightly, unconsciously assuming the role of spokesman. "Yes, sir. We're sorry about—" Brooks held up a hand. "I saw your apology to Gunnery Sergeant Simmons. That took courage." The teenagers exchanged surprised glances. But an apology is just words, unless it's followed by understanding and action, Brooks continued. "Do any of you know what the Marine Corps stands for?" They shifted uncomfortably, offering tentative responses. "Fighting for our country? Being tough? Semper Fi?" Brooks nodded. "Those aren't wrong, but they're incomplete. Our core values are honor, courage, and commitment. Words that are easy to say but hard to live by." He gestured toward Harold, who was still speaking with Colonel Harrison. "That man there has lived those values every day for over 50 years, both in and out of uniform." The medals on his chest tell only part of his story. The teenagers listened with unusual attentiveness, Jason especially. "What you witnessed today wasn't just a ceremony," Brooks continued. "It was a demonstration of something essential that many civilians never see, the unbroken chain that connects Marines across generations. When you mocked that uniform, you weren't just disrespecting one elderly man. You were disrespecting a legacy of sacrifice that stretches back nearly 250 years. Brooks's tone remained measured, educational, rather than punitive. "I'm not here to lecture you. What's done is done, but I am here to offer you an opportunity." "What kind of opportunity?" Jason asked cautiously. The base hosts a civilian orientation program, 1 day of experiencing, in a very small way, what Marine training involves: physical challenges, team exercises, history, values. Brooks looked at each teenager in turn. It might help you understand what that uniform really represents. The teenagers exchanged uncertain glances, but Jason nodded slowly. "I'd like that, sir." "Me too," said one of the others, followed by reluctant agreement from the rest. Brooks handed Jason a business card. "Call this number tomorrow. Mention my name. They'll arrange everything." He paused, then added, "This isn't punishment. It's education, the kind you can't get from books or phones." As Brooks turned to rejoin the military contingent, Jason called after him. "Captain?" Brooks looked back. "Is there something we can do today, right now, to make this right?" The question seemed to catch Brooks by surprise. He considered for a moment, then beckoned Jason to follow him. Together they approached Harold and Colonel Harrison, who paused their conversation as Brooks and Jason drew near. "Gunnery Sergeant Simmons," Brooks said formally. "This young man has a question for you." Harold regarded Jason with the same steady gaze that had faced down enemy fire decades earlier. "Sir," Jason began, his voice steadier than he felt, "I've accepted Captain Brooks's invitation to visit the base and learn about the Marines. But I'd like to do something more, something to honor what you and others sacrificed." Harold's expression remained neutral, waiting. "My school has a history project coming up," Jason continued. "We're supposed to interview someone who lived through an important event." He swallowed hard. "If you'd be willing, sir, I'd like to interview you about your service, to record your story so it's not forgotten." A subtle change crossed Harold's weathered features, not quite a smile, but a softening around the eyes. "You sure you want to hear old war stories, son?" "They're not just war stories, sir," Jason replied with unexpected insight. "They're American history, our history, and from what I've learned today, they're stories that need to be told." Colonel Harrison watched this exchange with evident approval. "The young man has a point, Gunny. Too many of your generation's stories are being lost." Harold considered for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, but we do it right. No social media nonsense. A proper historical record." "Yes, sir," Jason agreed immediately. "My history teacher can help. She's always talking about oral histories and primary sources." "And your friends?" Harold asked, glancing at the other teenagers who were watching from a distance. "They'll help," Jason said with conviction. "We all will." Harold extended his hand. "Then we have a deal, young man." As they shook hands, something significant passed between them, a connection across generations, a promise of remembrance, a small healing of the divide between civilian understanding and military experience. Sarah Manning, who had been watching this exchange, felt a surge of emotion. This was what her grandfather would have wanted, not just recognition for himself, but understanding for all who had served. The crowd that had gathered to witness an impromptu ceremony was now witnessing something equally powerful, the beginning of reconciliation and education, the passing of stories and values from one generation to the next. And it had all started with mockery transformed, through unexpected intervention, into respect. As the formal military ceremony concluded and the interaction between Harold and Jason took place, the crowd that had gathered began to transform from passive observers into active participants. What had begun as spectacle was becoming community. Frank Delgado, owner of the local diner 2 blocks from Wilson's Market, pushed his way forward. He was a stocky man with a Marine Corps tattoo partially visible beneath his rolled-up sleeve. "Excuse me, Colonel," he said, approaching Harrison with deference but determination. "I served with the 1st Marines in Desert Storm. Frank Delgado, former corporal." Harrison nodded in acknowledgement. "What can I do for you, Marine?" "My place is just down the street, Delgado's Diner. I'd like to host Gunnery Sergeant Simmons and all these Marines for dinner tonight, on the house." He looked toward Harold. "It would be an honor, sir." Before Harold could respond, another voice called out from the crowd. "I own the bakery next to Frank's place. We'll provide dessert for everyone." Then another. "I can supply coffee and drinks from my shop. What began as individual offers quickly cascaded into something larger. Business owners from throughout the ISB shopping center and nearby streets stepped forward, each wanting to contribute in some way to honoring the elderly Marine and the younger ones who had come to his aid. Harold appeared slightly overwhelmed by the attention, but Colonel Harrison smoothly intervened. "Your generosity is appreciated and in keeping with the finest traditions of community support for our armed forces. Gunnery Sergeant Simmons, I believe these good people would like to express their gratitude in a tangible way." Harold nodded, military discipline helping him maintain composure despite his discomfort with being the center of attention. "That's very kind, but not necessary." Frank Delgado stepped closer. "Sir, with respect, it is necessary. For us," his voice roughened with emotion. "My father served in Vietnam. He never talked about it, never got the welcome home he deserved. I'd like to do for you what I wish someone had done for him." Something in Delgado's words seemed to reach Harold. He nodded slowly. "In that case, I accept for your father as much as for myself." A ripple of approval moved through the crowd. The impromptu planning was interrupted by the arrival of a black SUV with official town insignia. From it emerged a woman in her 60s, dressed in a tailored suit, her bearing suggesting authority. "That's Mayor Wilson," someone in the crowd murmured. The mayor approached with a practiced politician's smile, but her eyes revealed genuine interest as she took in the scene. The Marines in formation, Harold with his newly presented flag, the diverse crowd of townspeople. "I received several calls about what was happening here," she said, addressing Colonel Harrison first. Then, turning to Harold, "I felt I should see for myself." Harrison provided a concise explanation of the events, from the initial harassment to the military response and subsequent ceremony. The mayor listened intently, then turned to Harold. "Gunnery Sergeant Simmons, I believe I speak for our entire community when I say we are deeply sorry for the disrespect you encountered today, and profoundly grateful for your service." Harold acknowledged her words with a slight nod, maintaining his dignified bearing. "Moreover," the mayor continued, addressing the gathered crowd as much as Harold, "I think what we're witnessing here today deserves more than just an impromptu gathering. With the colonel's permission, I'd like to propose we transform Mr. Delgado's generous dinner invitation into a proper community recognition event." She turned to the business owners who had offered their support. "If you're all willing, we could coordinate your efforts, make this evening something special, not just for Gunnery Sergeant Simmons, but for all veterans in our community." The suggestion was met with immediate approval. What had begun as individual gestures quickly coalesced into a coordinated plan, with the mayor's office providing the organizational structure to transform spontaneous goodwill into effective action. Sarah Manning, watching from nearby, felt a complex mix of emotions. Her simple phone call had cascaded into something she could never have anticipated. She thought of her grandfather, who had served silently and died with little public recognition. Would he have wanted this kind of attention? Or would he, like Harold, have accepted it reluctantly, understanding it was as much for the community as for himself? The store manager approached the growing planning committee, offering the use of the market's community room for coordination efforts. "We have phones, computers, whatever you need to get the word out." Within minutes, an impromptu command center had formed, with veterans naturally assuming leadership roles, organizing the evening's events with military efficiency. The mayor's assistant was on her phone, contacting local media. Business owners conferred about logistics and supplies. Jason and his friends, who had been standing uncertainly at the periphery, were drawn into the planning. "We need young people to help spread the word on social media," one of the organizers told them. "Make this right by making it big." The teenagers exchanged glances, then nodded in unison. This was their chance for redemption, to transform their mockery into something meaningful. Through it all, Harold stood at the center, the reluctant catalyst for a community awakening. He had spent decades avoiding attention, honoring his fallen comrades in private. Now circumstances had thrust him into the spotlight he had never sought. Yet as he watched the community mobilize around him, not just for him, but for what he represented, something long buried began to stir within his heart. Perhaps this was what healing looked like, not just for one old Marine, but for a community reconnecting with values larger than itself. As the community's response grew and plans for the evening's event took shape, Harold found himself increasingly uncomfortable with the attention. For decades he had lived quietly, his heroism known only to those who had witnessed it firsthand. Now, suddenly, he was the center of a growing celebration. Captain Brooks noticed Harold's discomfort and approached him quietly. "Too much, Gunny?" he asked with understanding in his voice. Harold gave a slight nod. "Never was one for the spotlight, Captain. Feels wrong somehow." Brooks guided Harold to a quieter corner of the gathering, away from the enthusiastic planning committee. Colonel Harrison joined them, his experienced eye also recognizing a Marine in need of respite. "Gunnery Sergeant, if you'd prefer to decline these festivities, I'll personally ensure your wishes are respected," Harrison offered. Harold considered this for a moment, then shook his head. "No, Colonel. These people need this as much as they think I do, maybe more." He looked out at the animated crowd. "But I'd appreciate some perspective being maintained." "What kind of perspective, Gunny?" Brooks asked. Harold's weathered hand unconsciously moved to touch the medals on his chest. "I'm not the hero here. I'm just the one who made it back." His voice lowered. "The real heroes never came home for their parades." Harrison nodded with deep understanding. "I'll ensure that's made clear, sir." Harold reached into the inner pocket of his uniform jacket and withdrew a worn leather wallet. From it, he carefully extracted several faded photographs, handling them with reverence. "These are the men people should be honoring," he said, showing the photos to Brooks and Harrison. "PFC Wilson, Corporal Martinez, Lieutenant Murray, 17 in all. Boys, really, none older than 25. The officers studied the photographs with appropriate solemnity. Young men in jungle fatigues, some smiling, some serious, all with that distinctive thousand-yard stare that combat veterans recognize instantly. I carry them with me everywhere. Harold continued, "When I put on this uniform, I do it for them, so they're not forgotten." Brooks and Harrison exchanged glances, both understanding the weight of those words, the sacred obligation that Harold had carried for half a century. "Gunny," Harrison said carefully, "would you consider sharing these photographs this evening? Not as a spectacle, but as a memorial. These men deserve to be seen, to be remembered by more than just those who knew them." Harold hesitated, protective of his private remembrance. "They're not exhibits, Colonel." "No, sir, they're not," Harrison agreed. "They're Marines, and Marines take care of their own, even after they're gone." This resonated with Harold. After a thoughtful silence, he nodded, "As long as it's done with proper respect. No sensationalism. You have my word," Harrison assured him as they spoke. Sarah Manning approached hesitantly, clearly wanting to speak, but reluctant to interrupt. Brooks noticed her. "Ms. Manning, is there something you need?" Sarah gathered her courage. "I just wanted to thank Gunnery Sergeant Simmons personally. My grandfather was Staff Sergeant James Manning. He served in Vietnam, too." Harold's eyes showed recognition. "Manning, Lima Company?" Sarah nodded, surprised. "Yes, that's right." "I knew him," Harold said simply. "Good Marine, steady under fire." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes. He never talked much about Vietnam, but he always stood a little straighter when other Marines were around. "We all do," Harold said softly. "It's not something we can explain to civilians." Sarah wiped her eyes. "He'd be happy to know I helped today. He always said we should look out for each other." Harold studied her face, perhaps seeing echoes of her grandfather. "You did right by him today. He'd be proud." This simple affirmation meant everything to Sarah. She had grown up in the shadow of her grandfather's silence, never fully understanding the weight he carried. Now somehow she had become part of that legacy. "I have to get back to work," she said reluctantly. "But I'll be at the dinner tonight, if that's okay." "I'd appreciate that," Harold replied. "Maybe you can bring a picture of your grandfather. I'd like to see him again, even if just in a photograph." Sarah nodded, too emotional to speak further, and returned to the store. As planning for the evening continued around them, Harold found himself increasingly drawn into conversations with other veterans who had been drawn to the scene. Each interaction followed a similar pattern: initial formality giving way to the unique camaraderie that exists between those who have served regardless of when or where. An elderly Vietnam-era Air Force veteran approached, introducing himself simply as Johnson, 366th Fighter Wing. Harold nodded in recognition. "You boys kept the skies clear for us." "Tried our best," Johnson replied, "not always successfully." No further explanation was needed. Both men understood the complicated reality behind those simple words. A younger veteran in a wheelchair rolled up next, Desert Storm Unit insignia on his cap. "Just wanted to shake your hand, Gunny," he said. "Your generation showed us the way." Harold clasped the offered hand firmly, and your generation carried on with honor. Through each interaction, Harold maintained his dignified reserve, but those watching closely might have noticed a gradual change. The burden of being the center of attention was being balanced by something else: the recognition that his presence, his story, his very survival, carried meaning beyond himself. He was not just an old man in a uniform. He was a living link to those who could no longer speak for themselves. As the afternoon progressed, the impromptu gathering at Wilson's Market began to take on a more organized structure. The store manager, a middle-aged man named Robert Chen, approached Colonel Harrison with a suggestion. "Colonel, we have a community room at the back of the store," he said. "It's not huge, but it could accommodate a small ceremony before everyone moves to the diner for dinner." Harrison considered this. "That's very generous, Mr. Chen. What did you have in mind?" "Just a more comfortable setting than a parking lot," Chen replied. "Air conditioning, chairs for the veterans, a proper space for what's happening here." Harrison glanced at Harold, who gave a slight nod of approval. "We accept your offer, Mr. Chen. Thank you." Word spread quickly, and the gathering began to migrate inside. Store employees hurriedly rearranged the community room, setting up rows of chairs and creating a small stage area at the front. Someone found a standing flagpole and positioned the American flag appropriately. Harold was escorted to a seat in the front row, flanked by Captain Brooks and Colonel Harrison. The Marines from the Honor Guard took positions around the perimeter of the room, their presence lending military precision to the hastily arranged space. As the room filled, a natural organization emerged. Veterans gravitated toward the front, many introducing themselves quietly to Harold. Civilians took seats behind them, respectful of the hierarchy that had spontaneously formed. Jason and his friends were guided to seats near the middle, their earlier status as antagonists transformed into something more complex. Mayor Wilson stood at the front of the room, welcoming people as they entered. She had discarded her political persona, instead projecting genuine warmth and respect. This wasn't a photo opportunity. It was a community responding to something authentic. Once everyone was seated, the mayor stepped to the improvised podium. "Good afternoon," she began. "What brings us together today began with disrespect but has transformed into something meaningful, a long overdue recognition, and a community awakening." She briefly recounted the events of the afternoon, acknowledging Sarah Manning's role in alerting the Marines and praising the military's response. "Sometimes it takes an unfortunate incident to remind us of what truly matters," she concluded. The mayor then introduced Colonel Harrison, who stepped forward with military bearing. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are in the presence of history today," Harrison began. "Gunnery Sergeant Harold Simmons represents the finest traditions of the Marine Corps and of our nation. His actions during the Vietnam War, particularly at Hill 8 and 61 in April 1969, exemplify the core values of honor, courage, and commitment." Harrison went on to describe, in appropriately measured terms, the events for which Harold had received his decorations: the rescue of wounded comrades under fire, the leadership shown in desperate circumstances, the wounds sustained while putting others first. Throughout this recitation, Harold sat stoically, his expression revealing little of the memories surely flooding through his mind. For him, these were not tales of heroism, but recollections of terrifying moments when training and brotherhood had overcome fear. "The medals Gunnery Sergeant Simmons wears," Harrison continued, "tell only part of the story. Behind each decoration are the faces of Marines who served alongside him, some who came home forever changed, and some who never came home at all." At this point, Harrison gestured to a small table that had been set up at the front of the room. "With Gunnery Sergeant Simmons's permission, we have arranged a small display of photographs, the men of his unit who made the ultimate sacrifice. I invite you all to view these images after our ceremony and to remember that each uniform represents not just one Marine, but many." Harold had provided his precious photographs, which store employees had carefully arranged on the table alongside small electric candles. This simple memorial, created in haste but with deep respect, would become the emotional center of the gathering. "And now," Harrison said, "with the mayor's permission, we would like to conduct a brief military ceremony honoring not just Gunnery Sergeant Simmons, but all veterans present and the 17 Marines from his unit who never returned home." Mayor Wilson nodded her agreement, stepping back to yield the space to the Marines. At Harrison's signal, 4 members of the Honor Guard approached the front of the room. One carried a bugle, one a folded flag, different from the one already presented to Harold, and 2 took positions on either side of the small memorial display. "Attention to orders," Harrison called, and every Marine present snapped to attention. The ceremony that followed was brief but powerful, a recitation of the names of the 17 fallen Marines from Harold's unit, the presentation of a memorial, flag that would remain with the community, and the playing of taps on the bugle. As the mournful notes filled the room, many wiped away tears. Veterans stood at attention, rendering salutes. Civilians placed hands over hearts. The teenagers, including Jason, watched in solemn silence, witnessing a tradition that connected generations of service and sacrifice. Harold remained seated throughout, military bearing intact, but emotion visible in his eyes. These were not strangers being honored. They were his brothers. Young men frozen in time, their potential forever unrealized, their sacrifices largely forgotten by a nation that had moved on. As the final notes of taps faded, a profound silence held the room. No one moved, no one spoke. The moment stretched, heavy with shared emotion. Then, from the back of the room, a voice began to sing. From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, it was the Marine Corps hymn, started by a veteran in the audience. Others joined in, the volume growing as more voices united in the song that had bound Marines together for generations. Harold finally stood, joining his voice to the chorus, standing tall despite the arthritis that plagued his joints. For that moment, he wasn't an elderly man being honored. He was once again part of something larger than himself, connected across time to every Marine who had ever served. News travels quickly in the digital age, especially when accompanied by compelling images. As the ceremony in Wilson's Market's community room concluded and the gathering prepared to move to Delgado's Diner, the story had already begun spreading. Far beyond the immediate community, a local news van had arrived earlier, capturing footage of the Marines in the parking lot and conducting brief interviews with bystanders. Now a reporter stationed herself outside the store delivering a live update to the evening news. What began as an unfortunate incident of disrespect toward a Vietnam veteran has transformed into an extraordinary display of community support and military brotherhood, she reported, the store visible in the background, where people were now emerging from the ceremony. Inside, as Harold prepared to leave for the dinner in his honor, he found himself approached by a television reporter who had managed to gain access. "Gunnery Sergeant Simmons," the reporter began, "would you be willing to share a few words about today's events with our viewers?" Harold hesitated, his natural aversion to publicity warring with his sense of duty. Before he could respond, Captain Brooks stepped in smoothly. "The gunnery sergeant has already given more than enough today," he said firmly. Any statement will come through official channels. The reporter looked disappointed, but nodded respectfully, recognizing the protective barrier the younger Marines had formed around Harold. Outside, more media had arrived, drawn by social media. Reports of the unusual gathering. The story was taking on a life of its own, resonating with people far beyond those physically present. Jason and his friends, emerging from the ceremony subdued and thoughtful, found themselves unexpectedly thrust into the narrative when a reporter recognized them from earlier witness descriptions. "You were involved in the initial incident with the veteran," the reporter stated, thrusting a microphone toward Jason. "Do you have any comment on what's happened since?" Jason looked momentarily panicked, but then straightened his shoulders. "I made a terrible mistake today," he said, his voice steady despite his nervousness. "I disrespected someone who deserved only honor. But what I've learned since then, about sacrifice, about service, about what that uniform really means, that's changed me." His simple, unscripted words carried an authenticity that resonated with viewers when the clip aired later that evening. As the gathering relocated to Delgado's diner, the ripples continued to spread. Veterans from neighboring communities began arriving, drawn by text messages and phone calls from those present. What had begun as a local incident was becoming regional, then national, as media outlets picked up the story. By evening, the hashtag #JohnRespectTheUniform was trending, accompanied by the video of Harold standing at attention while being mocked, followed by the Marines' arrival. The narrative had struck a chord, not as partisan politics, but as a reminder of values that transcended political divisions. Harold remained largely oblivious to his growing fame. At the diner, surrounded by fellow veterans and community members, he focused on the immediate human connections, sharing memories with other Vietnam veterans, listening to younger service members' experiences, accepting the community's gratitude with quiet dignity. Sarah Manning had returned after her shift, bringing a framed photograph of her grandfather in his Marine uniform. The resemblance between the two men was striking, not in physical features, but in the bearing, the eyes, the indefinable quality that marked them as warriors. "He would have been honored to be here today," Sarah told Harold, her voice catching slightly. "We served in different units, but we fought the same fight," Harold replied, studying the photograph. "Brothers in all but blood." Meanwhile, the mayor was fielding calls from state officials, veterans organizations, and even congressional offices. What had begun as a spontaneous community response was evolving into something more formal. "Yes, Senator," she said into her phone, stepping outside the crowded diner for privacy. "We would certainly welcome your support for a more permanent recognition." She listened for a moment. "I agree completely. This isn't about politics. It's about respect and remembrance." Inside, Frank Delgado moved efficiently among the tables, ensuring everyone was served. His staff had been reinforced by volunteers from other local businesses, all eager to contribute. The diner had never seen such a diverse gathering, military and civilian, young and old, all backgrounds united by a shared purpose. At one table, Jason and his friends sat with two young Marines from the Honor Guard, engaged in earnest conversation. The teenagers listened attentively as the Marines explained their paths to service, their training, their sense of purpose. The mockery of that morning seemed to belong to different people entirely. "So after high school, you just enlisted?" one of Jason's friends asked. "Best decision I ever made," the Marine replied. "Found a purpose bigger than myself." Jason nodded thoughtfully, something shifting in his expression. Across town, the story continued to spread electronically. A video of Harold's impromptu speech in the parking lot had been uploaded and was gaining views exponentially. Comments poured in from across the country. "This is what respect looks like. Thank you for your service, Gunny. Where can I donate?" To support veterans in his community, other veterans began sharing their own stories in response. Brief glimpses into experiences often kept private, moments of service and sacrifice rarely discussed in civilian life. A digital community was forming around Harold's story, creating connections between people who would never meet in person but who shared a common understanding. By nightfall, what had begun as a teenager's mockery had transformed into a national conversation about respect, service, and the often invisible wounds carried by those who wear the uniform. The ripples continued to spread outward, touching lives far beyond the small community where it all began. 1 month later, Harold Simmons stood in the parking lot of Wilson's Market, his posture as straight as ever despite the years that weighed on his frame. He was not in uniform today, just slacks and a button-down shirt, but he carried himself with the same dignity that had impressed even his mockers that fateful afternoon. Beside him stood Mayor Wilson, Colonel Harrison, Captain Brooks, and a small crowd of community members, including Sarah Manning, who had taken the day off work for this occasion. At the front of the gathering were Jason and his friends, transformed from antagonists to allies by the events of that day. They were all here for the unveiling of a simple bronze plaque mounted on a stone pedestal at the edge of the parking lot. The inscription read, "In honor of all who served, especially those who never returned, dedicated to Gunnery Sergeant Harold J. Simmons, U.S. Can, the 17 Marines of his unit who made the ultimate sacrifice, Vietnam, 1968-1969. Respect the uniform. Remember the sacrifice." The mayor stepped forward to address the gathering. 1 month ago, an unfortunate incident in this very spot became a catalyst for something extraordinary, a community rediscovering the meaning of service and sacrifice. Today, we dedicate this permanent memorial, not just to Gunnery Sergeant Simmons, but to all who have worn the uniform of our nation. The small ceremony was nothing like the spontaneous gathering a month earlier. This was planned, formal, deliberate. Yet it carried the same emotional weight, the same sense of something important being acknowledged. Harold had initially resisted having his name on the memorial, but had finally agreed when the focus was broadened to include his fallen comrades. Their names were listed on the back of the plaque. 17 young men who never grew old, never had the chance to stand in a parking lot as respected elders. As the ceremony concluded and people began to disperse, Jason approached Harold. The teenager had changed in subtle but significant ways over the past month, his posture more upright, his handshake firmer, his eyes more direct. "Mr. Simmons," he said, "I wanted you to be the first to know. I've enlisted in the Marine Corps. I ship out to boot camp after graduation next month." Harold studied the young man carefully. "That's a serious decision, son. Not one to make lightly." "I know, sir. It's not about making up for what happened. It's about something I discovered that day, something I want to be part of." Harold nodded slowly. "Your reasons are your own, but make sure they're the right ones. The Corps doesn't need guilt, it needs commitment." "Yes, sir." "That's what I found. A purpose." Harold extended his hand and Jason shook it with newfound confidence. "Then serve with honor, young man. That's all any of us can do." Nearby, Sarah Manning watched this exchange with a bittersweet smile. Events of that day had changed her too. She had begun recording interviews with local veterans, creating an oral history archive at the community college where she had enrolled in evening classes. Her grandfather's story was the first she had documented, pieced together from family memories and Harold's recollections of the man he had briefly served alongside. The ripple effects continued to spread outward. The video of Harold standing at attention while being mocked, followed by the Marines' arrival, had gone viral. It had been featured on national news programs, discussed on talk shows, shared millions of times across social media platforms. What might have been a passing moment of disrespect had instead become a national conversation about honoring veterans. Wilson's Market had embraced its unexpected role in this story. A Military Monday discount program had been implemented. The community room now featured a permanent display about local veterans. Mr. Chen, the store manager, had discovered his own connection to service. His father had been a South Vietnamese soldier who fought alongside American forces. Captain Brooks had been promoted to major, his handling of the incident cited as exemplary leadership. He still found time to visit Harold regularly. their initial connection having developed into genuine friendship across the generations. Colonel Harrison had established a new community outreach program at the base, bringing civilians and military personnel together for mutual understanding. The program included the day at the base that Jason and his friends had experienced, an opportunity now extended to all local high school students. For Harold himself, the most profound change was internal. After decades of carrying his memories, largely alone, he had found a new purpose in sharing them, not for personal recognition, but to ensure that those who never returned were not forgotten. He had begun speaking at local schools, his quiet dignity and straightforward accounts of service resonating with students in ways that textbooks never could. As the small crowd dispersed from the dedication ceremony, Harold remained for a moment alone with the memorial. He reached out to touch the names of his fallen brothers, men forever young in his memory. "You are remembered," he said softly. Then he straightened his shoulders and walked toward the future, an old Marine who had finally found his way home, not to the country he had left half a century earlier, but to a community that had learned, however belatedly, to see beyond the uniform to the man who wore it, and to the sacrifices it represented.